3 feasts was Israel to keep every year? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on Walking Through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, turn to Exodus 23. We're going to be reading from verses 14 to 19. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus 23, beginning at verse 14. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you have sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until morning. The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. In chapters 21 through 23, we have the judgments of the Lord that would be included in the book of the covenant, becoming part of the law of Moses. They contain judgments that would affect every portion of Hebrew life. They had laws concerning slavery. They had laws concerning violence. They had laws concerning justice. And they had laws concerning farming. In this section, we find that they had laws concerning 3 feasts of the Lord. By reading the Old Testament, we know that there were more feasts than just these 3, but these 3 feasts held special significance because for these 3 feasts, all males of Israel, presumably 20 years of age and older, just like in the sentences, were to present themselves to the Lord. This did not mean that females and children couldn't be at these feasts, but it did mean that all adult males were to be there. The first feast we have discussed already in chapters 12 and 13, and that is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Included in that feast is the Passover. It would take place in the month of Abib, beginning on the night of the 14th day of the month and ending 8 days later. One of those days would be the Passover, and 7 of those days would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That is why in the Gospels, so many people were in Jerusalem when Jesus was crucified. They were there for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The other 2 feasts have thus far not been mentioned, and they will be further explained later, so we will leave much of our comments on those feasts until then. But we will deal with how these feasts relate to Jesus here. The Feast of First Fruits was a feast in the late spring that would become known as the Feast of Weeks, and in the New Testament as the Feast of Pentecost. It is where Hebrews would bring the first fruits of their harvest to the Lord, the first fruits that were told not to be delayed back in chapter 22. As we will see in our later studies, the first of the first fruits was offered on the first day after the Sabbath corresponding with the Passover, in other words, the first day of the week. And it would be this offering that would begin the counting of the Feast of Weeks, which would be 7 Sabbaths plus 1 day after the first offering of the first fruits. This corresponds to 50 days, hence the name Pentecost. Why is this important? Jesus rose on the first day of the week according to Matthew 28, verse 1. The day after the Sabbath of the Passover was the day of the first offering of first fruits. In 1 Corinthians 15:23, Jesus is called the first fruits of those who would be resurrected from the dead, giving Christians hope of their own resurrection. That means that the first fruits and the Feast of First Fruits are a foreshadowing of what Jesus would do for mankind in being raised from the dead and bringing salvation. Like with the Passover, all males were expected to appear before the Lord for this feast too. Hence another reason that there were so many people in Jerusalem to hear Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. The final feast mentioned here is the Feast of Ingathering, later to be known as the Feast of Tabernacles. It would occur at the end of the year and would occur around the same time as the Day of Atonement in the 7th month of the year. If the Feast of Passover is in the 1st month of the year, corresponding to our late March and early April, then the Feast of Tabernacles would correspond to our October. This feast corresponded to the end of the harvest, and like the other 2 feasts before it, was another time during the year that all males were to appear before the Lord. Now you might think that traveling to where the tabernacle would be, in Shiloh for many years, and later to the temple in Jerusalem, would be a burden for the people. In saying this, though, we need to remember a couple of things. 1, the people were not going to be so far spread out that this would be a long journey. We think of the Jews of Jesus' day, or the Jews of today, being spread out across the globe. But at the time this law was given, Israel was going to be the size of about 240 kilometers or 150 miles from Dan to Beersheba. This was not a long distance, and so God was not asking too much of them. However, more importantly, these feasts served as a reminder of what God had done for Israel. He brought them out of Egypt, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He provided them the beginning of harvest, the Feast of Weeks, and the end of harvest, the Feast of Tabernacles. Israel needed constant reminding of who God was and what he had done, and these feasts accomplished that purpose. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus chapter 23, verses 20 to 25, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.